Good morning, students. Today we are all moving to section 4 of our lesson, which deals with the role of women in the French Revolution. As we have already seen that under the old regime, all men were also not even equal. So we can't expect that the women were accorded equal rights under the old regime. In fact, it was believed that men and women had different spheres and different roles in society. Many philosophers of that time, for example Rousseau, also thought the same, that men and women had different spheres of work and role in society. What was the cultural climate of France during the Revolution? There were cries of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Women were too influenced by the philosophers of that time and by the Enlightenment ideals. There was a new term coined citizen, which was widely used and did not differentiate between a male and a female. At the very beginning, the French women were at the forefront of the revolution, taking lead in all the events that happened throughout the revolution. The women were active participants in the storming of the Bastille, and they were also at the forefront in the march on Versailles when they demanded that the king and queen be brought back to Paris. They were at the forefront of the rioting at the bread shops during the substance crisis. So, throughout the revolution, they were extremely active with their past participation. Women hoped that their involvement would pressurize the revolutionary governments to introduce measures to improve their lives. Most of the women of the Third Estate had to work for a living. They were either seamstresses or laundresses, sold flowers or fruits or vegetables, or worked as domestic help in the house of the prosperous people. So they led very tough lives. Also, most of the women did not have access to education. It was only the daughters of the nobles or of the wealthier members of the third estate who could actually study. But even after their education, their families arranged marriages for them. Working women also had to care for their families and also look after their children. Their wages were much lower than those of men. So, in order to voice their interests and discuss their opinions, women started their own political clubs and newspapers. The most famous of this being the Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women. Around this time, about 60 women clubs came up in different cities of France. The most famous of the revolutionary women was Olympe de Gouges. She was one of the most politically active women in revolutionary France. She protested against the Constitution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, as they excluded women from the basic rights that each human being was entitled to. Addressed her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen to the Queen and to the members of the National Assembly, and demanded that they act upon it. In 1973, Olympe de Gouges criticized the Jacobin government for forcibly closing down the women's clubs. She was tried by the National Convention, which charged her with treason. Soon after, she was executed. Here you can see some of the aims of the Declaration of Rights of Women. The Declaration of the Rights of Women are also listed on page 20 of your textbook, and you have an assignment wherein you're going to compare this with the previous document that stated the rights of man and citizen. One of the major demands of the women were that they should be allowed to enjoy the same political rights as men. They were highly disappointed with the Constitution of 1791 that reduced the women to passive citizens. They demanded the right to vote, to be elected to the assembly, and hold political offices. Then only they felt that their interests and rights would be rightly represented. In the early years of the revolution, the revolutionary government did introduce some laws that helped to improve the lives of women. They created state schools where schooling was made compulsory for women. Their fathers could no longer force them into marriage against their will. Marriage was made into a contract and entered into freely and registered under civil law. Divorce was made legal, and now women could train for jobs. However, under the Jacobean Club, the new government issued laws ordering of closures of all the women's clubs and banning their political activities. Many prominent women were arrested and a number of them were executed. Women in France continued their struggle for the right to vote and associated their struggle with the international suffrage movement for women that was carried on in the next 2 centuries throughout the world. It was finally in the year 1946 that the women in France won the right to vote. One of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobean regime was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. Now, what was this Atlantic slave trade? Just let's take an example to understand this triangle. As you can see in the figure, this is a triangle and we have three people located at each corner of the triangle. We have the girl, Mary, we have Bob on the right hand side and James on the left hand side. James presents Mary with a flower pot. Mary keeps the flower but trades the pot with the seeds to Bob. Bob uses the pot and the seeds to grow more flowers and then sells the flower pot to James. James again presents Mary with a flower pot. Mary keeps the flower, trades the pot and the seeds of the flower to Bob. Bob grows the flower, again sells the flower pot to James, and so on this cycle goes. Thus, this triangular trade keeps on going on where each partner is dependent upon the other. This was roughly how the transatlantic slave trade was carried out throughout the world starting from 1650 to 1860. The French had three colonies in the Caribbean, the Martinique, Guadeloupe, and San Dominico, and these were suppliers of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. But Europeans were reluctant to work in unfamiliar and far-off lands in the scorching heat. So how was this crisis of labor shortage on the plantations to be dealt with? The answer was in the Atlantic slave trade. French merchants set off from the ports of France to the African coast where they brought slaves from the local chieftains. Branded and shackled, these slaves were tightly packed into ships for a 3-month-long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, where they were sold to the plantation owners. Many of them died on their way, and their bodies were overthrown into the ocean. The exploitation of the slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in the European markets for sugar, coffee, and indigo. Throughout the 18th century, there was a little criticism of slavery in France. The National Assembly did not pass any laws, fearing opposition from businessmen whose incomes depended on the slave trade. It was the convention which in 1794 legislated to free all slaves in the French colonies. However, 10 years later, Napoleon reintroduced slavery. Slavery was finally abolished in the French colonies in 1848. Here are some tips to guide you as you answer the questions. We have completed section 5 of the French Revolution, and in the next class we shall be completing the chapter. Please be ready for an assessment test very soon.